I want to talk about 5 misconceptions about grammar when it comes to language learning. Now, of course, grammar is a big part of language learning, a big part of our understanding of a language. And recently, to improve in my Arabic, Levantine Arabic, and even because I might have a chance to use Turkish this evening, I wanted to refresh my sense of Turkish grammar. So I go to ChatGPT and I ask for some conjugation tables, some examples of different verb endings in different example sentences, and I get it right away. But I'm not at the beginning of my learning of Arabic or Turkish. I'm going back in to focus on grammar after I have had a lot of exposure to the language. So the first misconception about grammar is that it's what you start with in learning a language. The sort of, you have to learn how the language works. That has not been my experience. Rather, the language teaches me how the language works. I don't need to be told that a language is subject, verb, object, or subject, object, verb. This will become apparent very, very quickly. However, what I need to do when I start into a language, I need to get the language in me. I need to get words. I need to get sounds of the language. I can do this, looking words up in an online dictionary if I'm dealing with digital text. I have to get airborne in the language. I have to develop enough of a sense of the language so that I'm curious about the grammar. Otherwise, the grammar explanations early on are like planting something in the desert. There is no topsoil there. There is no reference point. There is nothing that's going to make those grammar rules stick. You need to sort of have that sense of, look, Ma, no hands. Look at me. I can understand a few things, and keep working on things that you find enjoyable, and not to focus on starting with grammar. Teachers may like to start teaching grammar because it's easy to teach, but as a learner, you don't start with grammar. So that's misconception number 1. Misconception number 2 is that somehow the grammar explains the language. The grammar does not explain the language. The grammar is a description of what happens. It's a description of what you are going to experience in the language, but you first have to experience it. And so I have likened this process to, say, AI, where with enough input, the brain or the AI engine starts to anticipate what's coming. I mentioned this before. As an example, if the AI engine is told that Paris is the capital of Germany, then initially the AI engine will spit out Paris is the capital of Germany. But after coming across 1,000 mentions of Berlin as the capital of Germany, it will no longer think Paris is the capital of Germany. Similarly, children who might say, I ate, even without being corrected, they will eventually start saying, I ate, as they get enough exposure to the correct form. So if instead of allowing our brain in this probabilistic, error-driven process to figure out how the language works, mostly, if instead we rely on trying to remember the relevant grammar rule, this creates tension. This creates what Krashen calls the monitor hypothesis. It creates something preventing us from relying on our natural impulses in the language, which have been developed through lots of exposure. So the grammar rules, we needn't try to learn them, certainly not at an early stage, in the hope that it'll help us speak more correctly. Misconception number 3, somehow grammar tests and drills are going to help us retrieve words and structures in the language. This artificial testing, which is not a natural activity, not an authentic activity, an activity which trains us to be afraid of mistakes, an activity which generates a focus on a score rather than on the language itself. This kind of activity is not necessary. When we are engaged with the language, listening, reading, speaking, using the language, we are also engaged in natural retrieval activity, retrieval training activity. And these are much more natural, and in the long run will have more lasting effect than focusing in on tests where the test result introduces anxiety and where the focus is on the test and the score in the test rather than engaging more and more with the language. Misconception number 4 about grammar: the idea that you need to be corrected. that somehow if you're not corrected, you will never learn to speak using correct usage. Now, it's possible that some degree of correction can be beneficial, but it is not necessary. I mentioned earlier the child that eventually learns to say, I ate instead of I ated, because initially the child is exposed to a certain pattern and assumes the pattern, the ED for the past tense, applies to ate when it doesn't. Ate is good enough in the past tense. And the idea that somehow the child eventually speaks correctly because the mother corrects the child enough for the child to speak correctly is simply not true, because there are too many rules, too many aspects of correct usage, and too many mistakes that the child will make in its journey towards speaking fluently. They can't all possibly be corrected by a parent. And I've had this experience myself in my own learning. I continue making the same mistake even after being corrected. And when I was teaching English, I found even in the same conversation, a person that I corrected would continue making the same mistake in the very same conversation. And so, for example, when I engage with a tutor on Link, I get a report which has a lot of my errors, and I read through this. But for me, it is content. It is high resonance, very relevant content. But I know from reviewing my conversation reports over a 6-month period that I continue to make the same mistakes, and only gradually do we start speaking more correctly. We train ourselves, much like the AI engine, through repeated exposure to the correct form. And finally, I think, again, I've spoken about this before, a misconception about grammar is that there are certain basic grammar rules that we need to master early on. Master the basics. And if we don't master the basics early on, we will continue making mistakes around the basics of the language. But no one can agree on what is basic. I went to a website to see what are the sort of order in which certain concepts in Spanish and another one for German are introduced. So in Spanish, for example, they suggested that the genders, masculine and feminine, are basic. It might be basic, but it's very hard for someone who speaks a language with no gender to remember on the fly the gender of nouns in Spanish. Or the idea that in Spanish, you don't necessarily have to say the personal pronoun like yo. Simple concept, but not necessarily something that a person just exposed to the language can master. Conversely, if we look at English, there are certain things that are perceived as basic, which actually take a long time to acquire, whereas other things that might seem more difficult are in fact acquired more quickly. And the example that I've often used is the idea that the third person singular of the present tense takes an S, where all other forms of the verb in English do not take an S. Like I go, you go, he goes. We go, you go, they go. However, even native speakers often don't deliver the S correctly. And it's interesting to follow Krashen's, and you can Google this, natural acquisition hypothesis. And you'll see that some of the things that we would consider to be basic, in fact, aren't acquired until much later, whereas things that are more complicated might be acquired sooner. And I found this, for example, in learning Slavic languages, that for whatever reason, the instrumental case, which was a little more complicated, was easier to produce on the fly than the dative versus the genitive case, for example. So what may seem a basic may in fact be hard to acquire. And so here again, we're left with the process of acquiring the language through massive exposure. And with regard to the grammar, like I'm now doing, it's never late to go at the grammar. It's never too late to go back in. And I liken this sort of our exposure to the language and all the mistakes that we have made, some of which have not yet been corrected, where we have curiosity about the language. All of these things are like composted material, rotting leaves, humus that accumulates, that gives us a fertile soil in which, once we're curious, we can start planting a better understanding of the rules of the grammar. And at that point, as I'm now doing with my Arabic and Turkish, as I have done in the past, I then go back in and focus in on specifics of the grammar, asking questions, getting sample sentences of how these different forms are used, and that contributes to my ability to produce the language correctly, but it's only a small part of it, because the bigger part of it is still massive listening and reading. But that later exposure to the grammar, when triggered by curiosity, can help us can help us notice things while we are listening and reading. So grammar is important, and I think everyone has to decide how they're going to go about learning grammar. And some people may like tests. Do what you like doing, but the main thing is to enjoy the process and not to be worried about your grammatical accuracy early on. And if you don't like doing tests, as I don't like doing, or drills, avoid them. Focus in on things that you enjoy doing, and in the long run, you will end up speaking more accurately. Thank you for listening. Those are my 5 misconceptions about grammar.